Hello and welcome to the Rogers Brief. I'm Adam Rogers. Thank you for watching and thank you for listening. Today was day 43 of the Mass Casualty Commission proceedings, and the proceedings today were, characterized as part of an ongoing attempt by the Commission to reduce the size of their audience. Today featured a panel discussion, or they term it a roundtable discussion for some reason, on rurality, so living in a rural community and what that entails. I'm going to talk about that for a little bit. I'm also going to talk about two news stories. One is a series of articles, another is a story that came out in the Canadian press today, which are relevant and they've come out recently. One is about some brewing discontent, some further brewing discontent from the families, and the other is a new individual whose statements have been taken by the Mass Casualty Commission, but whose evidence, some really interesting stuff, has not been published otherwise, and there's no indication that the Mass Casualty Commission is going to do anything about it, and it relates to the killer Gabriel Wortman's previous criminality and his history of smuggling and such. So I'll start with the actual events of today, and like I said, there was a roundtable discussion on living in a rural community and what that entails, further to some of the panel discussions that we had last week. Now, I watched a part of that this morning, and then I had to take a break for some meetings and came back, and I was listening to it this afternoon again. And so when I do things like this, I'll check through Twitter and scroll through and see what some of the coverage is of any of the portions I've missed. And there was nothing. There was no tweets. There was there was a few tweets, nothing from the media really that were doing any live coverage of it. So that's certainly not a great sign. I'm not quite sure what the commissioners are getting out of these panel discussions. It seems clear that the research team of the Mass Casualty Commission certainly enjoys these discussions, from PhD candidates, professors from here, there, and everywhere. I would expect that there's lots of people making money off this, adapting, warming over their research to this new situation, getting money from the Mass Casualty Commission and us as taxpayers, of course. But I'm not sure how much of any of this is really going to contribute to the final report of the Mass Casualty Commission. There are a lot of generalities and things that weren't really on topic. So I'll come to that in a second. Let me back up and tell you who was involved. First of all, we've seen Dr. Emma Cunliffe, who's facilitated some of these other discussions before. She was facilitating today's roundtable, which also featured Robin Campbell, who's a PhD candidate at Dalhousie, Madonna Doucette, who is the director of the Youth Project in Cape Breton, Dr. Karen Foster from Dalhousie, Dr. Lesley Frank from Acadia. People might know as the author of the annual Nova Scotia Child Poverty Report, and as well Dr. Marilyn, MacDonald, also from Dalhousie. Some of the topics that were discussed today were food insecurity, child poverty, modern gender issues in Mi'kmaq communities. Again, all of these things are important in their own right and, deserve some serious discussion and consideration, policy responses, all of those things. But none of them have anything to do with a denturist being able to assemble a replica police car, acquire illegal guns, smuggle them across the border, evade police for 13 hours on a killing spree. Nothing that was discussed today is a response to that. So, it makes me consider that the final report from this commission is more likely to include a series of broad statements on topics like rural life, to, say, here's things that are different about rural life, without any real commentary or insight into the specific events of the mass casualty. We'll see. But these days of discussion of topics without linking them to the actual events, because that was not discussed at all today. Any linkage between the expertise of the people presenting and speaking in these discussion panels and the events of the mass casualty. So from the commissioner's perspective, and they're going to have to write this report at the end, you would think they would want someone to sort of give a first draft of, well, here's what the expert would think of, considering their, line of expertise, the events, make that connection, present that to the commissioners, and then the commissioners can refine that or, consider balancing off one person's opinion versus another to come up with a final report. But they're not even getting that first step. They have to, take this broad research and then try to imagine a connection to the event. So I've talked about that before. It's a real procedural flaw in the Mass Casualty Commission's choice of how to operate. So it's too bad. It's a real shortcoming in terms of the usage of the experts, but we'll see how that turns out. The two articles I want to discuss, one is an article from today, and the other is a short series of articles, and I think there's a third one coming. I read two over the weekend. So the Canadian press is reporting that the families are considering their participation or reconsidering their participation in the Mass Casualty Commission proceedings. We already know there was a boycott in reaction to several staff sergeants from the RCMP being permitted to testify without cross-examination by video, without anybody being in the room to observe them. What's come up now, many would know, is that Lisa Banfield, the common law spouse of the killer for 19 years, is going to testify next Friday, and she is going to be questioned only by Mass Casualty Commission lawyers. There will be no cross-examination of Miss Banfield, and she's only testifying for one day. Other witnesses, police officers who were limited to participating in press conferences and the decisions related to those, are testifying for a day and a half, 2 days, subject to cross-examination. The person that knew the killer the best, was with him for 19 years, is getting 1 day, no cross-examination. So quite unacceptable. The other thing that's happening next week is that the entire week is structured leading up to Ms. Banfield's testimony on Friday, and it's the label that is attached to the calendar are Understanding Mass Casualties and the Role of Gender-Based and Intimate Partner Violence. All right, well, undoubtedly there's a linkage, but it really presupposes Ms. Banfield's testimony. It presupposes not only the content of it, well, we know that because we've read some of her statements, but also that it's going to be credible and accepted factually. And normally you would wait until after a witness testified in order to do that, but what it seems to be doing is structuring the flow of information, of topic coverage, to flow into her evidence on Friday and reinforce or artificially reinforce the concept of her as a victim of intimate partner violence when there's many questions about some of the factual elements behind that. So we'll see how that looks next week. We don't know what's going to happen exactly Monday to Thursday, but we know on Friday it'll be Miss Banfield testifying. So we'll see how that goes. I'm going to have more on that. I'm going to have do a piece next week, or a portion of one of my pieces is going to be questions that should be asked. Now, they're not going to be cross-examination, so it's all the more pressure on the lawyer doing the direct examination to do a thorough job of making sure that we cover those important topics in her direct examination. So I'll have more to say about that next week as we're watching the proceedings. The other article, or series of articles that came out, was from Paul Palango, who's writing for Frank magazine. And he was writing about a really interesting character, Robert Doucette, sometimes referred to as Rob the Carpenter, who claims in his statements to have assisted Wortman with smuggling weapons across the border, who has claimed to have constructed hiding places for those firearms in his cottage and his warehouse building, who claims to have received a phone call from Canadian Border Services Agency soon after the mass casualty events, and that on that phone call, officials were aware of 2 of the guns that were smuggled across the border. He says that Wortman did indeed have a cell phone. Actually, he called 911 on the morning of April 19th, 2020 to let the police know, or try to let the police know, that Wortman had a cell phone, the particular weapons that he had on him, and was trying to give some assistance during the crisis, during the shooting itself. He also claims, Doucette does, that the statements that he's given to the Mass Casualty Commission have been heavily edited. Would be interested to see or hear exactly what he thinks have been excluded from those statements. And so it raises many questions. I mean, there's, Mr. Doucette's credibility, of course, is going to be a question until or unless he testifies, but there certainly seems to make some legitimate connections to things that we know otherwise. So he's not someone to be just written off automatically. But it raises another sort of structural question with the Mass Casualty Commission, because they seem determined not to do any investigation or discussion into Wortman's criminal past, including any discussion of his criminality, crossing the border. We know that we've heard that he's had guns supplied to him. Well, did the police know? Did Border Services know? If they did, what did they do with the information? What should they have done with the information? If they didn't, and this is a person that's engaged in a not insignificant level of activity, why didn't they know? And that should be examined as part of a criminal intelligence review. Rather than some of these panel discussions, which are really not edifying at all, almost offensive in their simplicity from somebody coming from a rural area. By the way, nobody in a rural area uses the word rurality, which was the topic of the panel today. Spending more time on the actual events, checking into some of his past dealings, starting the witnesses off with Miss Banfield rather than waiting till what will be almost the 50th day of proceedings before hearing from the most important witness. All very curious. So we'll see what happens. I'll be tracking to see any further reactions from the families as we get into next week's proceedings. And if there's no accommodations, an extra day for Miss Banfield, limited cross-examination, something along that nature, then I wouldn't be surprised if there are further boycotts or further actions taken by family participants. So we'll see how all of that develops next week. So I'll be back. There's no proceedings tomorrow or Friday, but on Monday there will be, and I'll be reporting on that here, and look forward to speaking with you then. Until then, thanks again for watching, thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.